everyone? It's me, Steph, aka Alter Nerd, and welcome back to the Planet of Nerds. Alright, let's get down to business then. On Netflix, my eyeballs watched very recently The Ripper. It's a one-off docuseries about the Yorkshire Ripper. Now, a little bit of background about myself. If you don't know, I'm Yorkshire. Born in Yorkshire, proper Yorkshire lass. If you can tell by my accent, you know it. If not, there you go. I've literally just pointed it out to you. Now, in terms of our local history, unfortunately, we did have a monster amongst our midst in like the 60s, 70s, 80s called the Yorkshire Ripper. He did unspeakable things to women, killed numerous in such a way that you just... Oh, to this day, I can't even fathom how a human being can do that to someone else. It's terrifying, and that's probably an understatement, given the evil monster we are discussing right now. So, first and foremost, The Ripper, the docuseries. If you've not seen it, get your eyeballs on it. I believe it's done in a way that it speaks the facts. Its sources are great, very reliable. But the other thing that I felt that was really, really good was that it didn't, how do you put it? It didn't sensationalize the crimes, if that makes sense. It actually treated the victims with reverence and respect. And for that, documentary makers, bravo, guys, bravo. Seriously, that was very, very respectful, and top marks for that, guys, top marks. Now, whilst you're watching that, if you've already watched it, or you may not want to watch it all, either way, you might be thinking, who the hell is this dude? Who is the Yorkshire Ripper? What's going on here? I found an article from The Oxygen, and the title, Who was the Yorkshire Ripper? The brutal serial killer who terrorised the UK in the 1970s. It wasn't just the 70s, it was the 80s as well. The Netflix new docuseries, The Ripper, which again I recommend you see if you haven't, chronicles the brutal crimes of Peter Sutcliffe. That is the guy who was the Yorkshire Ripper, and looks at what the lengthy investigation reveals about the United Kingdom at the time of his killing spree. Now, why was he called the Yorkshire Ripper? Well, firstly, he was from Yorkshire, but secondly, everyone knows about Jack the Ripper, the Victorian murders. The way that Peter Sutcliffe killed his victims, very brutal, very graphic. Literally ripped him apart like Jack the Ripper. Yeah. Very, very brutal, very scary, very, very evil. There you go. If you want to know what a monster looks like, that's what a monster looks like. So, the new Netflix docuseries chronicles the massive and costly years-long hunt for the man known as the Yorkshire Ripper, a prolific serial killer who drew comparisons to the infamous Jack the Ripper, who terrorised Britain nearly a century prior. While not as notorious as his predecessor, the killer known as the Yorkshire Ripper's brutal attacks targeting women left a similarly bleak mark on England in the 1970s and 80s, while police and the media's response to the murders provide a window into the complicated issues the country was working through at the time. The sprawling and often frustrating investigation into the killer's years-long crime spree is at the heart of Netflix's new 4-part docuseries, The Ripper. Police believe this was in fact a new version of Jack the Ripper. One hoaxer even claimed to be the killer, referring to himself as Jack, and at least one recording sent to investigators during the manhunt. But the killer's true name, Peter Sutcliffe, is now notorious in England. Now, the hoaxer, he sent in this recording and it completely derailed the investigation. They were looking for someone completely different. It completely took the spotlight away from Peter Sutcliffe. You know, they were looking for a guy that had a Newcastle accent, which is very, very different from a Yorkshire accent. So if a police officer found a suspect, but he didn't have a Newcastle accent, they completely disregarded him because of that hoax. They really believed that that recording wasn't a hoax and that that was Jack. Yeah, I know. Yeah. So because of that hoax, because of that recording, it allowed Peter Sutcliffe to continue being evil for a longer period of time. With that being said, Sutcliffe murdered 13 women that we know of and attempted to murder 7 more in northern England from 1975 to 1980. His killing spree prompted fear and hysteria across the region as police seemed incapable of catching the serial killer and no one felt safe and every man was a suspect, as Netflix states in its synopsis. Well, not quite because of that call hoax recording in the end. They were looking at someone with a Newcastle accent in the end, but there you go. Northern England went into near lockdown and women were encouraged not to go out alone as the killings continued. There was even at one point a curfew set for women, which was challenged at the time by feminists. And now, when I saw that part of the documentary, I had mixed feelings about that, because I'm there thinking, yeah, you know, why should there be a curfew set for women? At the end of the day, it's not women's fault. The police should do better and catch this monster. Women shouldn't be living in fear and they shouldn't have their freedoms curtailed because of this. But then, on the other side of the coin, I'm sorry, ladies, but he was unfortunately targeting females out at night. Like, no disrespect, but do you want to live or do you want to potentially die? And so I can see both sides of the argument. Let me put it that way. Furthermore, sexism and the devaluation of sex workers, Sutcliffe's targets, caused complicated issues in the ability to identify and capture the murderer. Netflix notes that it was a time of radical change, deindustrialization, poverty, masculinity and misogyny, all of which contributed to the Ripper evading capture for so long. Now, let's be very clear here. Even though there is this big wide belief that he targeted sex workers, there were some victims that weren't. So that flies out of the window right there. He didn't just target that portion of the female population. If you were female and you were out in the middle of the night on your own, sorry, but for the Yorkshire Ripper, you were a target. It's as simple as that. There we go. Victim shaming of the murdered women was common. As the series points out, victims' lives and their conditions of their homes were printed right alongside the details of the killings. The lengthy investigation concluded when Sutcliffe was finally captured in 1981 after police found him in a car with false license plates along with a sex worker who survived the encounter. Within days, he confessed that he was indeed the prolific killer that investigators were hunting. Now, who was Sutcliffe? Sutcliffe was born in 1946 in Bingley, Yorkshire, into a working-class Catholic family, the Mirror reported. His father, John Sutcliffe, explained in an archived interview included in the docuseries that as a child, his son was clingy towards his mother and preferred her company to the company of other boys, as they were, quote-unquote, were too big for him. He said that his son was a loner who was both kind and timid. The budding killer left school at age 15 and worked several odd jobs, including travelling salesman, grave digger and factory line worker. By 1975, he'd begun working as a truck driver. He eventually married a teacher, Sonia, in 1974, and they purchased a house in Heaton. They lived there until Sutcliffe's arrest. Now, let's put it this way. I mean, I'm 34 years old, right? So, I mean, all this happened and, you know, his sentencing and him going to prison a couple of years just before I was born, right? But where that house is in Heaton, I used to live just around the corner from there. When I was about, 10, 11 years old. I'd moved from Leeds to Heaton. And yeah, around about that time, that age, yeah, used to live just round the corner from that house. Yeah, they lived there until Sutcliffe's arrest. Sutcliffe's father said his son was probably the last person in the world you would have expected to become a serial killer. Journalist and novelist Joan Smith explains in The Ripper that she discovered a lot of sexism in Sutcliffe's world. When she did a bit of research on his background, the key thing that she noticed is that he grew up in an atmosphere where contempt for women and dislike of women was normalised. And the idea that women are victims, all of that, was there already. The journalist Smith claims that a young Sutcliffe witnessed his father beat his mother often and sided with his mum, which in effect led to him being called a sissy. For those that may not understand that vernacular, what a sissy means, basically means a soft touch, a male that's not masculine enough. He's not man enough. He's a sissy. He's too female. There's not much testosterone in him. You know, he's not you know, that kind of thing. Not worthy of being a man's man. You know, a sissy. And she goes on to say that he thinks he identified anything to do with women and femininity as a weakness, and at some point he switched and became a violent man himself, and think that this was a way of being a man. As the Ripper points out, police had interviewed him a total of 9 times before his arrest. And again, that goes back to that hoax with that Newcastle person with the accent. With the recording, they were thinking that they had to catch someone from Newcastle with a Newcastle accent, not a local Yorkshire lad with a Yorkshire accent. So yeah, he was interviewed a total of 9 times, but a lot of that would have been discounted because he had a Yorkshire accent, not a Newcastle one. Smith believes that investigators were wrongly chasing what they believed was a new version of Jack the Ripper, the still unknown serial killer who murdered at least 5 women in London during a 3-month period in 1888. Sutcliffe's victims, like those of Jack the Ripper, were often horribly mutilated. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, that's why he's called the Yorkshire Ripper, because there are terrifyingly similar things in terms of the crimes of Jack the Ripper to the Yorkshire Ripper. However, Smith believes that it was sexism that led the male investigators to ignore other linked attempted murders of non-sex workers. Yes. Former police officer Bob Bridgestock, who worked on the Sutcliffe investigation, told BBC Radio 4 earlier this year that he wasn't a very intelligent killer. He was just brutal. During his 1981 trial, Sutcliffe claimed that it was voices he heard while working as a gravedigger that told him to kill sex workers. He specifically blamed a voice coming from the headstone of a dead Polish man. Sutcliffe was ultimately found guilty of 13 counts of murder for the deaths of Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson, Irene Richardson, Patricia Tina Atkinson, Jane MacDonald, Jean Jordan, Yvonne Pearson, Helen Ritka, Vera Millward, Josephine Whitaker, Barbara Leach, Marguerite Walls, and Jacqueline Hill. He was also he was also convicted of attempting to murder 7 other women. He was handed 20 concurrent life sentences. What that essentially means is he was never, ever, 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 ever getting out, ever, in this freaking reality. Not a sodding chance. Sutcliffe, who had underlying health issues, just recently died in November last month in a hospital after he refused treatment for COVID-19, which he contracted behind bars. And may he rest in hell for the rest of freaking eternity. So, yes, that was who the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, was. A little bit of an overview of where he came from, his crimes, what he did, but also as well his sentence and his ultimate death, which, to be fair, for me, not a tear was shed at all. So, yeah, that's a little bit about that, who the Yorkshire Ripper was, the brutal killer who terrorised the UK in the 1970s and the 1980s. It should really put there, but there you go. This was an Oxygen article by Gina Tron. So yeah, I'll have the link in the description bar down below if you want to have a read through it and do a little bit more research about it. In the meantime, that's it for today. If you like this and you want more, subscribe down below, like, share, comment, all of that good stuff. And until the next time, you guys, laters.